Ditch those clowns and jokers. Join me in the middle with your independent minds. All you've got to do is click the subscribe button and ring that little bell, and you'll then get the most independent presentations on all of YouTube. Thanks for watching.
Question: which form of theft has you more concerned? Theft against your personality, theft against or theft of your safety, or theft of democracy? Meaning, do you have more of an individual concern given the unfolding events around us, or more of a collective concern over the stability of our government? I'll tell you why I'm asking this question, for a couple of reasons, actually. I am back on the road and delivering speeches to private audiences. In fact, I'm looking forward to being able to speak in small theaters like I did pre-pandemic to Sirius XM listeners and to CNN viewers and to folks like you who follow me on YouTube. The title of my current speech is, "It's time to change the channel." It's time to change the channel, because at the top of my prescription list for fixing that which ails the country, which is this deep polarization, unprecedented in the modern era, at the top of my list is a mixed media diet. And I'm reminded of this for a couple of different reasons. Last Sunday, Father's Day Sunday night, CNN had a special about the events of January 6th. I haven't yet had the chance to see it, but I saw it promoted. And Drew Griffin was the host of it. And in the footage that I saw of him promoting the special, he goes out kind of old school 60 Minutes, morally safer Mike Wallace style, and knocks on someone's door who doesn't know that he's coming. And the person on whose door he's knocking is a former Marine who's been charged in connection with the events of January 6th for, breaching the Capitol. And Drew Griffin wants to talk to him about the events of that day and the footage that has come to light, some of it really harrowing, showing protesters beating members of law enforcement. And the guy's response is to say, among other things, when Drew asks him if he's familiar with the footage and of all of the events of that day, the guy says something like, "I don't watch your garbage." I know he used the word garbage in speaking of CNN. And I thought, well, there's the problem. I'm accustomed to seeing the footage of January 6th on a loop, because obviously I watch a lot of CNN. I also watch our cable competitors. The problem that we have in this country is that half of folks walking around, they don't see that footage. And therefore, they probably don't know the extent of the violence inflicted against law enforcement on January the 6th. It's just an example, a top-of-mind example for me about the siloed nature of the existences that we're leading. People who are consuming news outlets only on one side or the other side of the ideological spectrum. And now let me bring it to today, because I came to work listening to Sirius XM and monitoring news stations, including cable outlets, and it was like a tale of two cities. In other words, in some outlets, it was all about the failed vote in the Senate, where Democrats were unified. They had Joe Manchin on their side. They were seeking to thwart a voting rights bill, or at least so says today's New York Times. And that was the coverage. The Republicans were lockstep against the Democrats. The Republicans were imperiling democracy. The Democrats were trying to do something about it. At another outlet that I heard coming in today, it was all about crime, crime, crime. And the border and CRT. There's now even an acronym for critical race theory. By the way, my view is that all of the above, maybe not critical race theory, are deserving of attention. But I need to go to multiple outlets in order to get all the information that I'm looking for about them. With regard to CRT, I think it's a solution in search of a problem. Like, where are the schools? Not on the Upper East Side or West Side of Manhattan, but where are the schools in Middle America where there really is a move afoot to change the curriculum in line with critical race theory. When we get to that point, I'll be more apt to talk about it, but I don't want to get bogged down by that. So my point is, we all need to change the channel. We need to mix up our media diets. We need to be covering all of these stories. And as between, going back to my original question, as between whether as an election issue, people will be more concerned about and motivated by fear of theft against them versus theft of our collective democracy, I think the former is a stronger issue than the latter. And that brings me to Tom Friedman, who writes for the New York Times today. The Friedman piece is titled, "Want to Get Trump Reelected? Dismantle the Police." And Tom Friedman says he has 3 news stories from recent headlines that have him terrified. First, the unfolding reports about how Trump's Justice Department secretly seized the personal data of journalists and Democrats in Congress. I've talked about that extensively on radio. I've talked about all these issues. Second, the efforts by the Republican-dominated state legislatures to pass voter suppression methods. That takes us to SR 1 and the vote that was held in the Senate yesterday. Third, and this is what he spends the most time on, as the Times just reported, homicide rates in large cities, many of them run by Democrats, were up more than 30% on average last year and another 24% for the beginning of this year. Soaring murder rates and policing are becoming huge Republican and right-wing media talking points. Democrats are vulnerable, and that's why President Biden plans to lay out a forceful anti-crime strategy on Wednesday. For the future of our democracy, says Friedman, we need to make sure that until the GOP stops being a Trump cult, its power is limited. And then there's a lot of discussion about what's going on in Minneapolis because Tom Friedman is a native Minnesotan, and he makes a number of very salient points, not the least of which is that black residents make up about 20% of Minneapolis, but well over 60% of the shooting victims. Alas, you'd never know that from public discussion. He then quotes a community leader, because these shootings mostly don't involve white cops. The point being that what gets all the attention is the cop on minority violence, think George Floyd, but meanwhile, the more typical case is something entirely different, usually a death not at the hands of law enforcement, and that this narrative is not getting covered the way that it should. It's the last part of his opinion that really caught my eye and caused me to craft today's survey question at smerconish.com. Friedman says this: last week, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, at Fry's request, that's the mayor of Minneapolis, ordered the National Guard to start preparing to be sent into Minneapolis if needed to help local police keep the peace. This is political dynamite for Democrats. The Trump cult GOP will pound them on this policing issue. Biden needs to keep rallying his party tightly around his right answer: transformed policing and sufficient policing, not defunding the police. Because if people feel forced to choose security over democracy, concerns about stealing outside their door over stealing an election, beware, way too many will choose Trump and his cult. I think he's right. I think that all politics are local. I think that our initial instinct is to be protective of our own safety and that of our family. And if the two competing channels, emblematic of the two competing parties, if one of them is all about democracy and protecting democracy and replaying the events of January 6th and making sure it doesn't happen again, and replaying the election of 2020 and making sure that the challenges aren't carried out the same way or given as much heft amidst a lack of evidence, like if that's one narrative and another narrative is safety in the streets, it'll be the latter that'll be victorious. If the competing visions are one of, are you more worried about the theft of your personality and your safety or your democracy, I'm sorry to say that democracy is going to play a secondary or subservient role. Both, by the way, ought to be the objectives. Both, this dichotomy of one or the other, is what needs to end. You got to change the channel to get the full story. So my survey question today at smirconish.com asks, do you agree with Tom Friedman that if people feel forced to choose between security and democracy, way too many will choose Donald Trump? I think the answer to that is yes. Which has you more concerned, and which, these may be two different issues, and which is a more potent political issue? If the two competing narratives are worrying about safety, meaning personal, or worrying about democracy. Post your comment here, share this with a friend, and make sure you're voting on today's survey question at smirconish.com. Thanks.